There are games that aren't shy in showing where their influences are from. Some show their influences in a direct way, with presentation homages in how they present their content, while some are more subtly influenced by the design over time, and some, like with today's game, literally indicate the direct influence in the game's press release, indicating that they directly took influence from Celeste, the developers Games from Earth, and the publisher Bonus Stage Publishing bring you Sunblaze, a platforming level-based challenger that releases on June 3rd, 2021. It costs $14.99 and releases on the Nintendo Switch and the PC, specifically on GOG and Steam. But before I begin this review, this key was obtained from the publisher, Bonus Stage Publishing, for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Sunblaze has you taking control of a young girl named Josie, aka the hero in training Sunblaze, who lives with her superhero father, a bastion for the community and who she looks up to. She's gung-ho and ready to get started in her training, and like a good father, he doesn't throw her directly into the fire, but starts to train her in a virtual reality training course. Soon after starting, however, her father and her find that something is very wrong in the simulator, as they can't leave the training course easily. Well, actually at all. It doesn't help that they get separated rather quickly, and she must find a way to fix whatever is going wrong and learn what it takes to be a hero along the way. This virtual reality course sets up the main structure of gameplay, which is short, single-screen based levels, and a lot of them. Like 700 or more or something, which you have to get through one by one in the only rational way you can, grabbing a computer chip to finish the level and get to the next area. Cause you're in a simulation, and that's how real coders do it. We just touch a chip and make the things happen. Trust me, I've got a degree in this. You do that with a couple of moves. First, you have a double jump. Typical for the genre, but standard nevertheless. On top of that, you can cling to the sides of platforms, even those with spikes on the edges, but of course, be careful. You also have a dash that will reset when you touch the ground or perform specific acts, and you can cling to the wall and slide down it when you hit it. Now, please note that walls do not act like infinite jumping points here, as your jump will not be reset when touching it. This isn't Super Meat Boy rules. This is more, well, standard. And really for your main skill set, that's about it. Most of the other elements that will bring variety to the gameplay are environmental in nature. For example, you'll have ceiling poles you can hang onto and small hand grasps you can grab onto, along with some hazards that you'll be able to interact with later on, such as smashing against a brick to make it move, or floating ooze that you'll be able to stick in for a brief period of time, but don't stick around too long because that happens. Over the 6 main worlds of the game, each world will start off easy with whatever specialized hazard or focus that it'll throw at you in that section, and will get progressively harder in the world, for the most part. Some areas do have more than one hazard, and when a new one is introduced into the area, the difficulty curve resets for a little bit. Now, the difficulty is multifaceted here when it comes to how it challenges you. One level may focus on precision jumps in a small area, unable to touch certain hazards, and having to move your character with quick series of small movements. Then later on, you may have to focus on timing, moving your character to safety zones and within sync of the environment and how it's moving. Or it could be a more puzzle-based challenge, having you need to mentally map out how things move so that a particular platform is released in the right order so you can actually get to the goal. It's one of the game's strengths The fact is that this puzzle platforming, this speedrunning platforming, it hits a lot of different subgenres within platforming, and I appreciated that. It's not just trying to go at one element at you, it's trying to test you as an overall platformer. Which leads me to one of the bigger strengths that the game has, the game's control set. What you want out of a precision platforming game is two major things: the ability to perform moves without an extreme amount of effort, and the consistency in the physics with the ability to repeatedly perform the same type of jump at a whim. Now, for the purposes of this review, I played on the PC with a Nintendo Switch Pro controller, but the keyboard and mouse, well, specifically the keyboard, worked just fine. It's just that I'm more used to the controller for platforming games. Nevertheless, Sunblaze mostly hits the mark when it comes to controls. The amount of times where I got mad at the game was rare when it came to this, as most of the deaths occurred with me not knowing the game's mechanics yet, or just me not executing what I needed to do. Now, there was moments where I questioned the hit detection, in particular when standing on the edges of platforms with spikes or lasers near them, and finding that sometimes the range of the precision seemed a tiny bit off. Not necessarily the biggest of problems here, but there were a couple of curse words uttered at that point. This was in a small subset of the levels, mind you, and overall the game gave me what I needed to succeed control-wise. We'll get to the other part in a little bit. The game is definitely designed with speedrunning in mind, however, as many of the levels and the initial cycle in which to avoid a hazard is literally right after the level starts. Now, that may sound weird at first. Of course it would be right after the start, but I mean like a millisecond after it starts. There's no time to wait around or get yourself oriented. You gotta be right on if you want to get in the first cycle. That can make it feel like it's pushing a little bit more aggression than other games similar in the genre, but there's no need for you to go in that first cycle, especially in your first runs of the game when you're trying to figure out what you want to do. But it is nice to see that those levels got refined over and over again timing-wise, especially for the speedrunning community, who are going to appreciate the consistency there, or at least what I see the consistency there. And as I'll bring up, that makes it feel like the game has an audience in mind, but is open to other audiences as well. Mostly. One of the problems that I did see with the game is that when it comes to the level design, it isn't exactly indicative of teaching the player in certain ways. It's almost like you need to have a knowledge of how platformers work and what you can expect from them, that you sort of can see that here, and thus you apply that knowledge here. When it comes to the level design that forces you to think outside the box or force you to think in a certain way, Sunblaze does that at times, but not at others, and thus it can frustrate especially newer players to the genre. Which moves me into the level design and the overall difficulty of the game, because, well, let's be clear, that's what the level design is going to create. That difficulty if the controls are rather on point. Let's be clear, Sunblaze is a game that was designed from the get-go to not be easy. Yes, there are levels that can be easy to complete and help you learn certain mechanics. I would say when introducing the beginning mechanic of the level, Sunblaze is what you'd want. Slow and steady progression and getting harder and harder as things go along. However, when it hits you in the intermediate and expert level of that mechanic, where it is twisting that mechanic in a way that you may not expect, that it starts to get a little bit more hit and miss. When it hits, when you realized after dying for the 5th time of what the game actually wants you to do, that's the game at its best in my opinion. Rewarding you for thinking things out and executing it well. Hell, even the 10th or 15th time if you figured it out. But when you can't figure it out, or even worse, when you can't actually execute it despite knowing what to do, the game well, the game sort of leaves you up a creek without a paddle, sort of. How do I go and discuss this next part? Because it's going to bring up a sensitive topic in the gaming community. But I need to bring it up. Look, I'm not a spring chicken when it comes to games, and difficult ones at that. I beat Contra without the 30 lives code before, I've beaten Battletoads, I've beaten hard games. Am I a great gamer in every genre? No, not at all. And let's be frank, we've seen me do plenty of stupid things on stream at times. I mean, here. Some enemies cannot be harmed. Well, I learned that now. I will be the brave and sacrifice myself. Literally. But I would say I've got the experience to do well, and would put precision platformers toward the top third of games that I'm good at. And I'll give the game this. At no point did I ever feel like throwing the controller across the room, the last incident being a certain Kingdom Hearts Sephiroth battle when I was young. But man, this game is difficult and pushed my limits in a variety of ways, which for some will be great, and it's not like others will be taken out of the mix. See, it got so frustrating points that yes, I did use the accessibility settings that were available. Now, I know, you could tell me to get good and I'm a reviewer and everything like that, but what should be noted is that it wasn't as easy as saying that I couldn't perform a timing move. It was a combination of not seeing solutions to a puzzle, timing of hazards that I just couldn't get, to my hands starting to hurt after playing sessions. Yes, I'm an older player. Yes, I have my hands hurt at times. Hell, there was one particular level that I sat and stared at for a good hour trying to figure out what the path was, and I could figure it out. And I gave up and used it. And if I had to guess the number of times I used it, yeah, maybe 4 times out of the various levels that I played, the first 400 or so. Now, it's great that the game has major accessibility options, and I really appreciate it. More games need like what is available in Sunblaze. Specifically, there's a variety of them. You can choose to have higher jumps if you need just a little bit more of help, or you could turn on infinite jumps, dashes, and invincibility. Those options are great, and are needed for a game like this to appeal to a larger set of an audience. But when it comes to a game like Sunblaze, and how it's definitely trying to build itself in a speedrun and precision-like setting, those accessibility options come at a cost in the way they are implemented. Look, like I mentioned, there's a lot of levels in the game. Yes, I use the accessibility options at certain points with the thought I would come back and try them in a regular sense so that I could get through the game and this review and see the rest of the game's presentation and story. But there's one slight problem with that strategy. Good luck with figuring out specifically which levels you skipped over. Because, well, you can't tell it easily, and it doesn't show up in the menus. Which leads to a difficult discussion. How do you handle accessibility versus an obvious want for speedrunners to use your game as a challenge, or even be featured on something like AGDQ? Well, let's take Celeste as the example. Celeste indicated its assist mode with an option on the side of the save that you were doing. Here, not so much. And because you could turn it on and off easily, you may have done it for one and not the other. Which also doesn't help when the time element comes into play. The fact is, you don't know that your time was good. The fact is, you might have used the accessibility options, and I understand that certain people would be like, "Hey, you don't want to mark your players with the scarlet letter of, oh, you used accessibility." But when you're able to complete a level in 2 seconds with some of these level designs, with the fact that you have infinite jumps, yeah, that has a little bit more of a problem. In fact, one of the things that I'm a little bit interested by is the way it records times and deaths in this game. It's not by level, it's by chapter. And so if you wanted to, let's say, really improve one specific level in this game, that's really hard to do. You can, go through a chapter and see the time, but not the specific level. And I understand that a combination of levels make a chapter, and that's very similar to Celeste and some of its longer maps. But when you break it down into the small sections like you do here, I really would expect, well, that time constraint, that time for that specific section. Part of what is going to really make this game or break it for you is your own willpower. If you're the type of player who really loves a challenge and will never use those accessibility options, yeah, there is a very good variety of levels here. There's a lot of difficulty and it hits a lot of different buttons. And I think the game does a great job in keeping things paced well throughout the game. That you don't get tired of a specific, behavior or a specific series of jumps. You're going to keep on wanting to play. And if you're the type of player who likes accessibility options, likes the ability to play a game and a little bit more casual, you'll be fine too. The accessibility options are there, and hell, there's a Zen mode, which is basically an easier version of the game with, some of the levels taken out. Yeah, that's great too. But if you're in the middle, you're gonna need that willpower. That willpower to say, I'm gonna keep at this level, I'm gonna keep on trying, and only when you're at your breaking point do you say, I'm going to use an accessibility option. That's how you're going to get the most out of the game. And it's not like using the accessibility option is a problem. It's just the euphoria of getting over the hump just as you're about to tire out and you get that joy of, yes, I did it. That's where this game is at its best, like I said before. And I wouldn't want people to avoid that if at all possible. Shifting gears. For a game that was heavily influenced by Celeste, however, you can see it in accessibility options and the way the movement works, there's definitely parts of Sunblaze that don't do as well as its brother in arms. The story, it's very to the point and basic, and doesn't really gather the same emotional depth like Celeste does. I mean, it's not that Josie and Sparkles the unicorn, yeah, Sparkles is there, doesn't have a touching moment or two, and there isn't a lesson to be learned here. But it's clear that the story is playing a secondary part in this tale. There's just not enough of the world to build here in the simulator and the way it's built, and the small bits of exposition can't fill in the world building that Celeste was so good at. It doesn't help that the game holds the 3 characters throughout the entire run, and while it can have some touching moments of Josie learning and coming into her own, learning what it means to be a hero, there's just not enough of it, and you don't get enough of her to be able to, well, take advantage of it. One of the biggest mistakes that I think Sunblaze made in making a reference to Celeste in its press materials is that you're naturally going to make comparisons between the two. And one of the big ones in which Sunblaze suffers in is the world design. Now, I understand the story is about a simulator and about this hero, but Celeste was great in the world design. It brought forth this world, this vibrant place that told a story in itself in the environment. With the way these levels are designed, and it is a simulator, you lose all that. In fact, it feels, I don't want to say heartless, I don't want to say soulless, but it feels constructed for the purpose of gameplay as opposed to helping the story. I will say that visually, the game won't win any awards for presentation. but it's not one to shake a stick at either. Solid color schemes make it easy to tell what's happening action-wise, despite the reasonably detailed backgrounds at times. Sure, you have 6 worlds here, but even within a world, it will shift things up just enough so that it feels a little bit different. Grant, like how her suit changes the blue when she doesn't have a dash. It's such an easy thing to implement, yet makes a huge difference in enhancing the gameplay. I will say that Josie and her movement, it can work, but there's something that still feels, I don't know, off to me in terms of the visuals. I can't put my finger on it, whether it's me not being able to focus on her at times in terms of the screen, but something always drew my attention away from her at times, even though I can't necessarily say anything specific. Now, I do appreciate the simulator aspect in terms of the blood spatter that happens when you die staying on the background, and almost getting replaced if a foreground comes and loads in front of it. It does show you how many times you died subtly, and it really does add to the level design in that subtle way. I just wish there was more like that. Music-wise, it's okay, but only serves as a backdrop for the gameplay more than evoking emotion or being memorable in any sort of way. Again, Sunblaze unfortunately ends up making comparison to Celeste in its press materials, and while the music is fine here and is indicative of the platforming genre, it's nowhere near the quality of Celeste's numbers, and thus it falls short. But I'll let you take a listen to hear what I'm talking about. You also heard a little bit of the sound design there, and it's not anything too impressive. Part of what I have problems with the sound is that everything feels like it's a blunt instrument in terms of, oh, you got smashed, bash you over the head with the sound effect. There's no subtlety to certain elements of it, but there is subtlety to the footsteps or some of the jumps, and it feels inconsistent in that manner. It's not something that I felt like I needed to play the game with. Some of my tests that I do with video games in terms of sound design is to turn the sound off to see if it affects my gameplay, and here, not at all. None of the audio and the feedback really was necessary in order to play the game. And for some, that's going to be okay because some people won't actually turn the sound on. But for others, if you're really expecting a lot of good sound design here, I'm sorry, you're not going to get it. It's passable and helps in terms of, well, making some noise and making the impacts of action seem like they're doing something, but it just didn't catch me. In the end, Sunblaze is an interesting mix of a game that hits at the core of precision platforming, specifically in the speedrunning community, and collides it with accessibility for those who need a little bit of help. It's in a weird space of taking influence from games like Celeste in movement and gameplay in good ways, but not hitting those influences in the more story-based and music-based elements of its primary influence. It's a solid package at the price, but it's also constructed to be very similar to experiences for speedrunning purposes, and thus it doesn't necessarily stand out in one specific area. It's solid, but for a general audience, it's one that doesn't exactly stand out, and thus earns an 80 out of 100, making it a solid buy unless you're hurting for cash. But that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective elements in games and uses them to match games specifically to you. If you fall into one of the following categories, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game falls into a new buyability category for you. As you can see here, speedrunners and those wanting a challenge will have more reason to take a look at the game here, but there's definitely some people who will find the game to be designed specifically against them. That's it for this review. If you're wondering what's next on the channel, I'll be attempting to review an airport for aliens currently run by dogs. Yes, I said attempt because it's one of those games that I don't know exactly how I'm going to review. I'm also working on reviews for Mundan, Virgo vs. the Zodiac, Ring of Pain, and Resident Evil 8. Also, I should get back to Spiritfarer and all the other videos. Seriously, there's a lot I'm working on, almost too much to the point where I don't know where to begin. If you want to help out the channel, however, tell me games that you want me to review that are upcoming, and share the video with a friend and see if you can put some feedback in the comment section below. And to make sure I make good on a certain request from Discord, I'll be finishing this video with the most appropriate ending. A bird haiku. See you later, and as always, keep on gaming. The swallow flies fast, but will fly faster with a big rocket attached.